It's so good to see you. In today's video, we're going to be experimenting with making refrigerator magnets on the wood lathe. So stay right here. The good thing about making refrigerator magnets on the wood lathe is that they're so accessible to almost anyone with a wood lathe and some basic turning tools. You don't need a lot of fancy jigs or fixtures or chucks to be able to mount your piece of wood onto the lathe. There's a few different methods of doing that. In addition, there are multiple design opportunities and shapes you can do, as well as a ton of different decorating ideas to make your piece interesting. We're going to play around with a few of those methods today. I'm Jason Geiser, and this is Geiserwoodturner. Let's make some refrigerator magnets. The first thing we're going to gather up today are some magnets. And this stack came from a local hotel, and they were stuck to the dryer. They came out of some shower curtains. And you can also use something like a neodymium magnet or a rare earth magnet. They're always really shiny on the outside and strong. Whatever magnet you use, you're going to have to make sure and make the appropriate size recess in your piece of wood. So keep that in mind. Now we're going to start out today using these pieces of wood. I have a piece of walnut here that I've already prepped for a chuck, and so that's going to be one of the methods that we use for mounting it on the lathe. I have a piece of western spalted maple, and the grain configuration is running this way, as you can see, and so this is going to be a face grain configuration when we're turning it. This is a piece of Osage Orange, and you can see the grain running this way. This one we're going to turn in an end grain configuration, and you can see that kind of marked on the end here. We're going to put an inlay in this piece, and this is a piece of African Blackwood, and we're going to cut a little disc off of that so that we can inlay it into the end of this Osage Orange. And you don't always have to use a chuck. You can always use the faceplate that your lathe came with, and I've screwed a waste block onto this faceplate, and we can screw that right onto the headstock, and we'll be able to do some of our mounting for these magnets on this today. So you don't necessarily have to have an expensive chuck to do this work. So we're going to start out with our piece of spalted maple, and I've marked the center, and I'm drilling a 13/16 hole in this, and we're going to drill it down just enough so that that magnet is just protruding out of the end. With our waste block mounted onto the lathe, I'm just going to remove some of the material around the outside, and that's just so I can get in a little bit closer, and then we're going to make a tenon for our recess on our piece of maple to fit onto. And this doesn't have to be a super good fit, you just have to get it just right so that the end of it's going to touch the inside of the recess, because we're going to use a little bit of pressure sensitive tape here, and I'll put a link in the description on how you can get some of this. It's made specifically for this purpose. It's a little cold in the shop, and the wood that I'm working with is a little bit punky, so we're going to have a few problems with it, but you'll see what happens here. So you just want to make sure that that tape contacts the bottom of your recess, and then I'm going to bring up the tailstock and put a little pressure on that, and that's what holds that. The longer that that actually sits there, the stronger this will hold. So then we're going to round this and bring this to a cylinder, and then we'll be able to work with it. And I'm going to take my spindle gouge and start to shape that. I decided to switch over to my bowl gouge because it has a longer wing on it, and I can do a nice pull cut. Since this is in a face grain configuration, I can do a nice pull cut across there and remove material a little bit easier. So on the back with my spindle gouge, I'm just going to put a small half of a cove, and that's just so you can get your fingers around this to pull it off of the fridge. And then we'll just work our spindle gouge in, and we're going to try and get that down to where we can cut that off and part it off. Alright, and then we'll just clean up the end here and see how it looks. Now I can already tell that I'm going to need to stabilize this piece of wood. A lot of times when you have spalted woods, they get really punky and soft in places, and the grain likes to tear really easily. So I'm just going to soak it with some CA glue. This is a thin CA glue, and we're just going to let it penetrate the surface and get in there and make it so that we can take some light cuts and just take the surface off and not have any of the problems with tearing. And this is the point where the tape fails and the piece came right off the lathe. And it's a small piece, so I'm not too worried about it getting damaged or hitting anything. So we're just going to put another piece of tape on there and see if we can't get this to hold. And it's a little cold in the shop, so I was having a little bit of problems with this. I don't have as much problems outside when it's warmer. It seems to hold just fine on smaller pieces. So it allowed me to make some more cuts and get this cleaned up and ready to sand. And then it popped off of there again. So what I did was I grabbed a little piece of paper towel and I put it on there, and we got a nice friction fit, and that held really well, so I was able to sand it and put a finish on it. And for the finish, I'm using OB Shine Juice, and this is something that you put on in layers. It's shellac and boiled linseed oil and denatured alcohol. And if you've ever seen Captain Eddie Castellan, he uses this and has a recipe on his website for this. And it's a really great little finish, and it's something that you can polish up while the lathe's spinning, and it looks really nice and shiny, and that's beautiful. For our next magnet, we're going to use this piece of walnut that's already been prepared for a chuck. So I'm going to put that in the chuck and tap it a little bit to make sure it's good and centered as well as I can, and then I'll tighten up that chuck. Then we'll bring up the tailstock, and I'm going to use my spindle roughing gouge to just kind of true up everything and make sure that it's round again. And I have a little bit of waste on the end. This is a little bit too long, so I'm going to take my parting tool and just work my way down until I get that parted all the way off. And then I'll just take that waste that I don't want and I'll use it for something else later. And now I'm just going to take my skew chisel and smooth this up a little bit, and then we can measure out how long we want our magnet pull to be. And I think we're going to do something like a cabinet handle or a drawer pull, something like that. It's going to look like a little knob, so we'll mark it out to be about that long, and then we'll come over and we have to make a recess for our magnet. So what I'm going to do is take my bowl gouge and just kind of clean up the end of this and make sure that it's nice and flat and true so that we're ready to put a recess in the end. So just go across that and make sure it's good and flat. And then I'll take my skew chisel and make a little dimple in the end to make it easier to go in. And then I have to measure the diameter of my magnet with my calipers. And I'm going to mark a little line, and we'll go from there. I'm just going to bring up a pencil and make a little circle here so that I have some guide to go by. I'll take my spindle gouge, and using end grain hollowing techniques, I'm going to push that in and bring it to the outside. I'll take my skew chisel and just come in on that edge. This is a 1/4 inch spindle gouge. It's going to give me a little more room to work in this small recess. And I'm just going to be able to flatten out that bottom with this spindle gouge. And looks like we've got a long ways to go. So I'm going to bring a little bit more out, and this is where you just have to go a little bit at a time until that magnet fits. And then you're going to take that recess and make it just a little bit deeper. So I'll take my skew chisel and come down, and then I'm going to flatten out that bottom and make it a little bit deeper until the magnet just sits a little bit in front of the piece of wood so that it sticks to the refrigerator really well. Okay, so now we get to think about shape a little bit. So I'm going to make a little bead here on the end, and just going to roll that over and roll it back so I have some shape here on the end. And then I'd like to take in the middle here and just kind of make a cove. So I'll make a little bit of a reveal here next to the bead, and then I'll take that a little bit deeper and make a nice cove there to give it some definition. And then I'll start rounding the knob and just roll that over, and then just remove some of that waste material on the back side and just ride that bevel as you go down, and you'll get a nice shiny finish. There we go. We're just going to work this down, leaving enough wood in between so that I can easily sand it before I take it off of the lathe. So we'll get that down where we need, and I'm going to grab some 220 sandpaper to start on this one, and I'll work my way through the grits. And then I'll be ready to part this off of the lathe, and we can turn it around. So I'll use my thin parting tool and go down and just get it really, really thin. Then I'll use my favorite parting tool and I'll just grab it with my hand and it'll come right off. On this piece of walnut, we're going to turn it around and put it right back onto the piece of wood that we just cut it off of. And so I'm going to have to make a little tin in here, or spigot, so that it goes right back on, and we want to get this just right so that we have a nice friction fit. And so it takes a little bit of finesse sometimes. If you take off too much, you can always cut that off and make another tenon. Okay, so that fits pretty well. I'm going to just remove some of this material here just to get it out of the way, so that when I'm polishing it's a little bit easier. So we'll shove that on there, and it's really nice and tight. And then what I'm going to want to do is make some really light cuts, and you'll notice that all the cuts that I'm doing are pushing towards the headstock. They're holding that piece onto the piece of waste block that we have there, and that way it's a little less likely to come off of there. If you keep your tools really sharp, it's going to make all the difference, and you can get a really nice light cut and the shavings just come off of there. Alright, so we're ready to sand and get this so it's ready to polish. So we'll work our way through the grit sanding, and then I'm going to use some more of that OB Shine juice. I really like this stuff because you can layer it and get a really nice glossy shine. Don't put too much side pressure on this or it'll come off. So I'm going to tap my tool handle on the waste block and it'll pop right off of there, and we've got a nice beautiful piece of walnut. And the magnet fits great. Now on our piece of Osage Orange, we're going to use the same method we used before, and we're going to drill into the end grain this time. Just go down little by little until that magnet again fits, just protruding out of the end so it sticks well to the refrigerator. This is our piece of African Blackwood mounted into the chuck, and I'm just going to clean this up with my parting tool. And I've decided that we need about a 3/4 inch diameter disc, and it'll be about a 1/4 inch long or deep, just to make an inlay for our piece of Osage Orange. So I'm going to go down until I get 3/4 of an inch, and I'll just check it with my calipers, and as soon as that slips over, I know that I'll be at 3/4 of an inch. I'll just take a little bit more until I have about a 1/4 of an inch of thickness, and then I'll use my thin parting tool to part that off of there. And you can do this between centers or anything like that. It doesn't really matter. I've just had this ready for a chuck, so it worked perfectly for me. So we'll just pop that off of there, and we'll be ready to put that into our piece of Osage Orange. We'll set that aside for now, and then I'm going to get another fairly tight fit here with our Osage Orange. So I'm just going to bring that down a little bit to make sure that we're fitting on there nice and well. Then I'm going to clear out some material here with my bowl gouge just to get it out of the way. And I actually hit a screw earlier. I went a little bit too deep into the waste block, and so I'm going to mark that and then just keep going here so I don't hit it. And this method that we're going to use this time is hot glue. So I'm going to use hot melt glue, stick it on the end of our tenon, and then put that piece of Osage Orange on there really tight. And then I'm just going to have to wait for a little while for that glue to cool down, and it'll be ready to go, and it actually gives you a really good hold. I wouldn't use this on a really large piece, but it works great on stuff that's really small like this. Now that that's cooled, we'll just bring up the tailstock for some support, and then I'll take my bowl gouge and we're going to round this piece, get it down to a cylinder here, and we'll be ready to make our next kitchen magnet. From this view, you can see that I'm going to start on the other end for this time, and I'm just going to make that half cove here, just kind of round that down into that waste block just a little bit until I've got a nice place to hold and pull it off of the fridge with my fingers. Okay, and then I'm going to come across and smooth that a little bit, and I have a little bit too much Osage Orange here, and I might be able to use some of that for later, so I'm going to cut off this end piece here, and I might be able to make a inlay out of it for another piece. So I'm going to take my parting tool and just remove that waste. There we go, and I'll just set that aside for another project. And And I'm just going to take my spindle gouge and clean that up a little bit and get it ready to make a recess on the end. And I decided that I wanted to put a little accent piece. I'm going to put a burn line right here on the edge. So I'm going to make a little V-cut with my skew chisel, bring over my burning wire, just lay that on there and rest it and let the lathe spin and the friction do its work. Okay, now it's time to put our disc in the end. So we're going to make a recess similar to the way that we made a recess on our walnut piece for the magnet, but this time we're going to do it on the other end. So I'm going to face that off with my spindle gouge really quick. I'm going to come in and hollow that just a little bit, and we'll bring it out till we get to 3/4 of an inch. So I'll go in and bring it out, go in and bring it out. Just do this little by little. And you can hollow anything on the end grain this way. When you're doing a recess like this, you really want to make sure that you've got a really nice fit. So you're always going to be wanting to cut off a little bit of wood and then test it, and then cut off a little bit of wood. It's going to look the best if you've got a really tight fit between your disc and that sidewall. So we're not quite there yet. I'm going to bring in my carbide tool, and it doesn't quite fit in that little circle, so I'm going to tilt it on its side so that the bottom will clear that recess, the sidewall. And I'm going to come down with that, and I get a little bit carried away here, and I cut quite a bit off. And I'm flattening that out and a little bit more on the sidewall, and you'll see here as I stop and test that I went a little bit too far. So I test that disc, and it's loose in there, and I don't want that at all. That's going to leave a really weird glue line, so I'm just going to take this off, and we're going to make this magnet just a little bit thinner. But I've got enough room that I can do that, and it's fine. There's always these opportunities. If you make a mistake or get frustrated, go ahead and just take a break and think about it and start over again, and everything will be just fine. It'll work out, you'll see. Alright, so we're going to fit a little bit better this time, and we'll stop and test a little bit more often. And this time I decided to go back to the skew chisel and cut that sidewall down. It made a really nice clean cut when we were doing that recess before, and it seemed to work really well for this as well. So I just put the point of the skew chisel, the toe of the skew chisel is what it's called, right down the sidewall of that recess and into the bottom. Then I can bring it over a little bit and flatten that out. And now I've got a nice tight fit, and so I'm just going to clean up the bottom of this just a little bit and make sure that it's flat on the bottom, because I want a really good glue joint on this disc so that it's not going to come out of there, and that our inlay is going to look good when we're done. I'll take my carbide tool there and just clean up the bottom this time. Alright, there we go. That's ready to glue in there. And for the sake of time on this one, I just decided to use the CA glue, and that works just fine. You can use wood glue or anything else. I'll just put some into the recess in the corner and some on the back side, and just tap that in there with my tool handle. Make sure it's got a nice tight fit, and then I'll let that sit and cure for a little while. You don't want to start off and start turning this right away. It'll throw that glue, and it'll hit you in the glasses and the face shield every time, and it makes little glue dots on there. You don't want that. Plus it could come out of there. So now I'm going to clean this up with my spindle gouge, and I'm going to want to take off just enough so that I get that transition between the Osage Orange and the Blackwood just right. Cut off any of the glue or any space in there, and since I have a nice tight fit, it makes a really nice transition between those two pieces. So we'll do one more cut here, and it should be ready to put another accent onto this piece of Blackwood. For this, we're going to use a chattering tool, and I've made my own tool for this, but you can buy them commercially. This is just a sawzall blade that I've put in here, and it's going to bounce up and down on this piece of wood and create a pattern. and it only works in end grain because it only bounces evenly on end grain, and it's going to make a nice squeal when I put it on there, and if I'm doing it right it will, and then I'll know it's working. So I push it in there the first time and it just cut. I didn't get any chattering pattern at all, so I know I'm going to have to experiment a little bit more. And that's kind of why I left this piece of Blackwood a 1/4 of an inch thick, so I knew that if I messed up I could always cut off a little bit more material and try this again. So this time I lengthened it out a little bit and give it some more room to bounce, and I turned up the speed to about 1200 RPM, and I got a nice squeal out of it, and it bounced and made this really cool pattern. Let me try and get in on it really close, and you can see all the lines there. Now what I'm going to do is kind of accent those lines and bring them out by putting an edge on them. So I'll bring in my skew chisel and just at a 45-degree angle come in and make a V cut, and then I'm going to kind of round this center to make a little bead in the center. And again on the outside, just bring that straight in and it'll cut a V for you, and it'll accent the edges of those and just make them stand out and pop. And that turned out really smooth on the surface, and that's good because I'm going to have to do very little sanding right there, and I don't want to do any sanding across those lines at all because it's going to destroy them. So I'm going to sand the edge and very little on the face, and we'll be ready for our finish. So for the finish, a little bit more of the OB shine juice, and I'll put it right down into those grooves and accent in the middle, and then I'll rub it on the outside, and then you'll turn up the lathe and put some more on while it's spinning and let it create some heat, and that'll actually catalyze the oil and the shellac, and it'll cure really quickly. So you can put layer on after layer, and it's a really great little finish. I did find that in my accent piece there was a little bit of wet finish in there when it got all done, so I took some compressed air from my compressor and blew the nozzle in there, and it came right out and made everything look great and worked great. So we'll take this off and twist it to get it off with a glue, and there's a little bit of glue left in there that I'll just have to remove with my fingernail. Alright, so now we have our 3 magnets and they're ready to be epoxied into the wood pieces. So I removed that glue with my fingernail, and now I'll just flip these over and get ready to glue. So I want to test fit all the magnets and make sure they work. I had a few different magnets out of the shower curtain that were a little bit bigger in size and didn't quite fit in the recess, but all of these worked just fine. And I'm going to scratch up the back of these on a piece of sandpaper just to kind of give it a mechanical bond when I put it into the wood. It helps it stick a little bit better. So I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy, and we'll put out the epoxy and then the hardener and try and get an even amount here. And then I always carry some toothpicks in my shop, and I mix up small amounts of epoxy with toothpicks. It works really well. And we'll just mix that up really good and stir it around. And you've got about a 5-minute work time here to get that into the recess and get those magnets glued in there. So I'll just ball up a little bit on the end of the toothpick, and then I'll kind of scrape that off and roll it into the edge of this recess here. And it takes about 2 toothpicks full, and just stir that around in there and get it all over the bottom. And then you can press your magnet into there, and I usually give it a little twist to set it into the glue. You don't want to squeeze too hard and squeeze all the glue out, but if you do have some squeeze out, you can always clean it up with a paper towel really quick before it sets up. Alright, that one's ready to go. And sometimes when I'm doing this I don't wear gloves, because I've done it before when I wear gloves and I get epoxy on my gloves and then I get it all over the piece without even realizing it. I have to wipe that all off and it becomes a big mess. And this one I dropped and got it all over the piece and all over my hand, so I could feel that and I was able to just wipe that up. So this one we'll spread it all out into that punky wood, and we'll put the magnet in, give it a little twist again, and then wipe off the excess. There we go. That should work. And then we'll go on to the Osage Orange. All that glue is cleared out of the bottom and ready for some epoxy. it still has some dots and lines on the back side from where we marked it and centered it, and you can sand that off if you want, but I figure it's the back side and no one's really ever going to see that, so I left it on there. So we'll push the magnet into this one, give it a little twist there, and then wipe off the excess again. And this glue will take about 5 minutes of work time. In about 20 minutes it'll be tacky, and after 24 hours it'll be set up and super strong and ready to put on your fridge. Thanks for hanging out with me and making refrigerator magnets today. This is a really great project that you can use to improve your skills and your creativity, and also it's something you can experiment around with and make it look really cool for your friends and family. They make perfect gifts and something that doesn't take long to do, and it's easy to give away. I really love this Osage Orange and Blackwood magnet. I think it turned out really great and looks really sharp. Which of the 3 magnets was your favorite? Let me know in the comments. I really appreciate it when you make comments and talk to me about my videos. It makes me feel really supported. This channel is just past 3,000 subscribers and we're still growing, so I want to say thank you. So if you like wood turning videos and you haven't subscribed yet, why not now? Have an outstanding time, and we'll see you soon. I really love this thing.